38 years ago, a 19-year-old girl vanished without a trace on Myrtle Beach, right in the middle of a crowded summer night full of tourists, leaving her family plunged into grief and confusion. Authorities suspected a man who had been seen hanging around the boardwalk area might be involved. But with no body found, no direct witnesses, and almost no worthwhile clues, the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Yet, through all those long years, a team of cold case investigators never gave up, continuing to comb through every tiny piece of evidence, clinging to the slim hope that the truth was still somewhere in those dusty files. Then one day, while re-examining what seemed like a useless detail in the old evidence, a faint strand of hair buried by the sea wind, they spotted an anomaly that everyone had overlooked, a discovery that changed the entire case and left even the most seasoned investigators stunned. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy content like this, don't forget to hit subscribe. One summer night in Myrtle Beach, the atmosphere carried all the hallmarks of a coastal tourist town. The steady crash of waves against the sandy shore, sea breezes carrying damp air past the shops along the boardwalk, and neon lights shimmering on the dark water. People were still scattered along the wooden walkway, but as the night grew later, the crowds thinned out, leaving patches of darkness where the lights didn't reach. Down at the southern end of the boardwalk, where a section of the wooden pier led down to the wide-open beach facing the Atlantic Ocean, the sound of the wind drowned out the distant music from the bars. Shadows of late-night walkers stretched and disappeared as they passed occasionally, but most of that area had fallen almost completely silent. In that setting, Jamie Lynn Parker, a 19-year-old girl vacationing in Myrtle Beach with friends, decided to leave the group and head back to the motel early. They had spent a long evening wandering the boardwalk, eating, watching street performances, and stopping at a few souvenir shops. When she said she wanted to go back to the room, Jamie seemed completely normal, not overly tired, not upset, and showing no unusual signs that would make her friends take notice. A few people even remembered seeing her walking along the boardwalk that night, moving slowly toward the end of the wooden path where the lights started to fade. Witnesses described Jamie stepping down the section of pier that led straight to the beach, her long hair blown to one side by the ocean breeze, one hand lightly pulling her thin jacket to keep it on her shoulders, her petite figure gradually disappearing as she walked deeper into the shadows beneath the pier. From that spot, the nighttime ocean opened up into a vast emptiness, with only the sound of waves and the cold breeze rising from the water, making it easy to lose sight of someone if they stepped just a few paces away from the boardwalk's lighted area. Some couples out for a late walk said they had seen a young woman walking alone toward the beach, but no one noticed anything unusual, and no one saw her come back. Jamie disappeared into that darkness, as if she melted into the hot, humid night along the summer shoreline. When her friends returned to the motel later, they assumed Jamie was already asleep, since splitting up while out wasn't unusual. It wasn't until the next morning, when they saw her bed still perfectly made with no sign anyone had slept in it, that they started to feel uneasy. The bathroom door was closed and silent. Jamie's belongings were exactly where they had been, and there was no indication she had ever returned. After calling her name multiple times in the hallway, checking around the pool area, asking the night staff, and walking the boardwalk looking for anyone who might have seen her, anxiety turned to fear. A front desk clerk confirmed Jamie had not appeared at the motel since leaving the night before. Unable to find any trace of her on their own, her friends immediately contacted local police and reported that Jamie Lynn Parker had gone missing after leaving the boardwalk and heading toward the beach. All that was known at the time was this: Jamie had vanished completely on what seemed like an ordinary night. No one heard any cries for help, no one saw her running, no one saw her return, and there were no clear signs at all of what had happened to her in that dark space between the ocean and the sand. The morning Jamie was reported missing, the boardwalk area was quickly cordoned off in a wide enough radius to ensure that any remaining traces would not be accidentally erased by beachgoers. Horry County Police deployed forces fairly quickly, because even though Myrtle Beach is a bustling tourist spot, a young woman vanishing right in an area thick with visitors is always considered an unusual situation. The wooden pier section leading down to the beach where Jamie was last seen was roped off with yellow tape, blocked at both ends by temporary security posts, while the crime scene unit team moved step by careful step along the wooden path, their protective suits reflecting the morning sunlight and making the whole group stand out against the pale sand background. The first thing they did was establish the crime scene boundaries. No unauthorized person was allowed to enter, and no new footprints were permitted to overlap the old ones. The technicians began examining every part of the pier, the sand edge at the foot of the pier, and the shadowy area that Jamie had entered the night before. Curious tourists gathered outside the warning tape, trying to peer in and see what was happening, but police maintained the distance, not letting anyone get close to where evidence was being collected. Not long after the crime scene unit started searching the area, they discovered the first important piece of evidence, a small item lying off to one side on a sand dune, not buried deep, but far enough away that late-night walkers the previous night hadn't noticed it. The item was retrieved with tongs, placed in an evidence bag, labeled with a code number, and photographed on site. No one rushed to conclusions, but its presence indicated that Jamie had reached this area before disappearing. Up on the boardwalk, police separated each witness who had been in the area the night before. Kiosk workers, beach security, late-staying tourists, and even a few couples out for a night walk, asking them to stand apart and answer basic questions quickly. The separation was to prevent them from influencing each other or unintentionally repeating details overheard from others. Statements were collected continuously, recorded on audio, handwritten, and entered into a mobile system to reconstruct the timeline of her disappearance. A large map sheet was spread out on a wooden board set up temporarily under a field tent. Here, investigators used the classic but effective method, marking the position where each witness had stood, cross-referencing their lines of sight, and drawing a diagram of the places Jamie might have passed through in the 15 minutes before she vanished from sight. Dots began appearing on the map, the spot where she left her friends, where two witnesses saw her figure walking on the wooden pier, where another person spotted a young woman standing near the sand edge. However, when piecing it all together, the first clear contradiction emerged. One male witness insisted, "I'm sure I saw her walking with some man," but when investigators asked for a description of the face, build, hair color, or any distinguishing features, he couldn't remember any. His statement completely contradicted the woman who said Jamie was walking alone and no one appeared near her in the brief moment she was in view. The two statements were from the same time, same location, but the results clashed like two puzzle pieces that couldn't fit together. Police immediately flagged this statement as unreliable, but notable. Not credible, but impossible to ignore. Further questioning quickly made the investigators realize that Jamie's case was unlike those of tourists who get lost or leave the group voluntarily and return late. There was no credit card activity, no confirming calls, no sign she returned to the boardwalk after stepping down the pier, and the sudden, empty disappearance with no clear signs of movement on the sand surface created an eerie feeling that led investigators to quickly reach an internal conclusion. This case showed signs of suspicious circumstances. From that point, the Jamie Parker file was elevated to missing person priority case status, meaning all appropriate resources would be mobilized as soon as possible. The investigators, who were accustomed to the noisy, crowded Myrtle Beach and often dealing with minor tourist-related incidents, began to clearly sense that the silence surrounding Jamie's disappearance was unlike normal cases. The scene map was still there, with arrows and notes showing the path Jamie had taken, the last points where she appeared, and the pitch-black gap where no one saw her anymore. The first clues began to surface. The case officially entered the real investigation phase. The evidence found at the sand's edge on the first morning of the investigation was immediately taken to the temporary command tent for processing under strict protocol. It was a small item, not conspicuous enough for late-night beachgoers to notice, but distinctive enough for investigators to instantly connect it to Jamie. The crime scene unit placed the item on a metal table, used low-angle lighting to examine its surface, then photographed it from multiple angles before collecting fingerprint samples, stains, or any tiny fibers that might be clinging to it. When examined under oblique light, they noticed a thin, uneven layer of sand on the underside of the object, indicating it had not remained in one spot. Two technicians used probes to measure sand depth in the area, then cross-referenced the original discovery position, revealing that the item appeared to have been dragged or shifted about half a meter from its natural resting place. The surrounding sand showed unusual disturbance, small diagonal grooves partially filled by the sea breeze, but still clear enough to indicate some form of bodily contact or light dragging had occurred there. There were no signs of violent struggle, no deep imprints from knees or elbows, but those shallow grooves were still the first anomalous detail in what had seemed like an overly clean scene. One investigator measured the grooves and compared them to a template of Jamie's shoe prints, preserved from the flip-flops she wore on the trip. The size and shape did not match. Instead, those faint marks had depth and width, consistent with a much larger shoe size. Exact identification was impossible because wind and waves had blurred parts of the edges. But the tech team agreed that whoever made the marks was not Jamie. The spacing between the grooves further suggested the person wore heavy shoes with hard soles and took long strides, markedly different from the small, light gait of a 19-year-old young woman. This required the scene map to be updated. The area at the end of the wooden pier was not visited by Jamie alone. At the other end of the command tent, a technician specializing in trace evidence began using tweezers to remove individual grains of sand stuck underneath the item, then used specialized adhesive tape to collect any tiny fibers on the surface. Among the samples collected, one thing caught everyone's attention. A short, dark-colored hair strand caught on the edge of the item. It was immediately placed in a glass container, labeled, photographed, and moved to the DNA pre-processing table. No one jumped to conclusions about its significance, but the presence of a foreign hair on an item in the exact area Jamie entered last was always a critical factor in any investigation. Even more telling, the hair color did not match Jamie's. Under microscopic examination, they observed that the strand had greater thickness, a wider diameter than average women's hair, and clear cuticle layers, suggesting it belonged to a man. All this data was recorded but could not yet generate real hope, because in 1986, DNA testing on environmental hair samples was almost impossible to yield complete results. Nevertheless, investigators flagged this hair as a potential long-term lead, since any organic sample from the scene could become vital if technology advanced later. Meanwhile, analysis of the surrounding sand area continued to expand. They found additional faint drag marks, but not clear enough to distinguish between someone running, being pulled, or walking backward. There were no proper footprints, only discontinuous depressions indicating someone had stood or moved there, and then those depressions had gradually been filled by the sea breeze over time. Investigators assessed that the appearance of marks not belonging to Jamie in very close proximity to where she was last seen represented a significant shift in how the case was viewed. It partially ruled out the hypothesis that Jamie had simply gone for a walk and accidentally vanished, while opening the possibility that she had encountered another person right in that spot. Though not enough to determine the nature of the encounter, the coincidence of the displaced item, the disturbed sand, and a hair completely mismatched to the victim was leading investigators to lean toward contact between Jamie and another individual in the brief period before she disappeared. This information was added to the scene sketch in preparation for the next step, cross-referencing with witness statements and reconstructing Jamie's final timeline as accurately as possible. Compared to the chaotic initial morning, the case now had its first faint outlines blurry, but enough to signal that Jamie Parker's disappearance was not simply an accident or a voluntary departure from the group. And although a full picture could not yet be formed, the tiny clues just gathered from the beach sand were beginning to reveal that the truth behind the young woman's vanishing might be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The initial assessments of the beach sand area led the scene commander to request expanding the search radius down to the water's edge, where the terrain constantly changes due to tides and sea breezes. The Coast Guard team was called in to assist, bringing sonar equipment mounted under boats to scan the entire shallow water zone running along the wooden pier section. With clear seawater in the early morning and low waves, the sonar could produce a fairly detailed map of any objects lying on the bottom or suspended in the water column, thereby helping rule out the possibility of a body caught near the shore. Technicians adjusted the frequency for shallow water conditions and began scanning in parallel strips. The screen displayed the undulating outlines of the seabed, small sand ridges, a few submerged rocks, and intermittent dark patches of seaweed. There were no large shapes resembling a human body. The rare suspicious points were verified by probing with poles from the boat or diving down for direct inspection, but all turned out to be just seaweed, trash, or small rocks. Throughout the scanning, water level, wind direction, and wave force were all recorded for cross-referencing, and the overall results showed no unusual conditions the previous night that could have swept an adult out to sea without leaving signs. Tide schedules were consulted, revealing that around the time Jamie disappeared, the water was not high, the current was mild, and there were no strong rip currents in the area. This data quickly all but eliminated the swept away by waves hypothesis, shifting attention back to the sand surface where any movement was likely to leave even the smallest trace. Once the sonar operation concluded, the investigation team moved to comb the sand edge adjacent to the waterline, a zone where wind and tides could both erase traces and expose previously buried objects. Technicians used depth-probing rods combined with oblique lighting from portable lamps to detect areas with unusual texture. Natural sand has uniform compaction, but where an object had once lain or been buried, characteristic depressions or bulges would appear. Not long after, a notable discovery emerged about a few dozen steps from the spot where the first piece of evidence was recovered. A small, unnatural mound, contrary to the wind direction, caught attention. When the top layer of sand was gently brushed aside, a small dark object gradually came into view. The technician stopped immediately to photograph and mark the position, then used long tweezers to lift it without contaminating traces. This was the second piece of evidence, not large in size, showing signs it had once been on the surface before some force displaced it, causing it to sink lightly into the damp sand layer. It was not on the list of items Jamie had with her, according to her friends, making it even more significant. The surface of the evidence was covered in fine sand, but enough detail remained to see it had light scratches, possibly from scraping or friction against something harder. The sand adhering underneath and around it was also collected per protocol, since the sand's characteristics could reveal direction of movement or time of deposit. The evidence was taken back to the command tent for analysis under oblique lighting, UV lamps, and magnifying glasses. Under blue light, a few tiny fibers began to appear. Nothing was clear enough to conclude anything, but investigators noted that one edge of the item had a slide pattern in the sand, indicating it had been dragged or lightly kicked. This detail perfectly matched the shallow grooves on the beach previously recorded, reinforcing the assessment that movement by at least one person had occurred at the water's edge very close to the time Jamie vanished. The scene map was immediately updated. When the two pieces of evidence were plotted on the same coordinate system, they formed a line of movement that did not align with the direction Jamie took down the wooden pier, but veered to the left into the dimly lit area with less foot traffic and often shielded from view by wind for anyone standing on the wooden boardwalk. This prompted the reconstruction team to draw a new possible path. Someone identity unknown had appeared in the space between the pier and the waterline. Another detail that caught investigators' attention was the shape of the sand edge where the second item was found. The damp sand showed unusual compaction, as if someone had just stood there or placed something down and then left during a slight tide rise. When measuring the depression depth, one technician noted it was deeper than Jamie's estimated footprint but consistent with greater weight. There were no clear footprints, but that asymmetry was enough to support the hypothesis that the person standing at that point was not the victim. Discovering the second piece of evidence right at the sand-water boundary was a significant step forward. It not only expanded the search radius, but also clarified that the area where Jamie disappeared was not completely empty as initially thought. The fact that it did not belong to the victim further increased suspicion of another individual's presence at the scene, someone who may have had direct or indirect contact with Jamie before she vanished. All these details were entered into the case's electronic file, along with high-resolution images of the evidence, discovery locations, and descriptions of environmental conditions at the time of recovery. By systematically scanning the nighttime ocean and documenting new evidence, the investigation was gradually acquiring the first pieces of a still vague chain of events, but each discovery made the picture more concrete. The initial outlines were beginning to emerge, suggesting that Jamie's disappearance was not a natural journey interrupted, but rather a deliberate sequence of movements occurring in the darkness beyond the reach of the boardwalk lights. When the scene map was expanded following the discovery of the second piece of evidence, another technical team began focusing on the area right at the base of the wooden pier, where the sand shifts from fine to more compacted due to heavier foot traffic. This is typically where traces are harder for the sea breeze to completely erase, especially marks from heavy objects like wheels. One investigator used oblique lighting to scan along the underside edge of the pier, and just minutes later, noticed a narrow depression stretching across the sand, curving slightly to the left, as if something had pressed down on the surface and then moved away while the sand was still damp. Upon closer inspection, they clearly identified it as a tire track, but not from the large tires of trucks or jeeps commonly driven on sand. Instead, it was smaller and narrower. The groove had faint tread patterns along the edges, indicating parallel grooves on the tire surface rather than the aggressive knobs used for rough terrain. The technicians immediately marked it, photographed it from multiple angles, and placed a ruler to measure the tire width. The measurements showed this belonged to a small vehicle, not matching the types witnesses had described as pickup trucks or large dark vehicles from the night before. This created the first contradiction between physical evidence and statements, because a small vehicle with narrow tires would rarely be able to drive deep into the soft sand near the pier without getting stuck, unless it stayed on a firmer path or only rolled along the compacted edge. The claims of seeing a large vehicle parked near the pier therefore became more questionable. Investigators had to consider that witnesses might have misidentified it, or what they saw wasn't a vehicle at all, or they were influenced by dim lighting and distance. Yet the tire track was real, and it was in a place it shouldn't normally appear. The next step was determining the direction of travel. Two parallel grooves extended about 2 meters before disappearing under wind-blown sand. Technicians used probes to follow the depth, and when pushing deeper a few centimeters outward, they found a section of unusually compacted sand, indicating the vehicle had turned and then departed. In that direction, the tires did not head straight toward the ocean, but curved up to the right, toward a gap between two bushes along a side path, leading to an unpaved parking area. This path was rarely noticed, because it was almost completely dark at night. The reconstruction team extended the marking tape and followed the tire direction, discovering additional small depressions varying in depth, showing the vehicle had stopped or slowed at 2 points. When comparing track width and depth, they saw clear consistency. The sinking wasn't as deep as a heavy vehicle would cause, but enough to rule out a bicycle or handcart. This was a motorized vehicle of medium weight. From the point where it turned into that faint path, the tire marks vanished completely upon reaching the gravel-mixed ground, where surfaces rarely retain any shape impressions. Technicians tried UV light and fluorescent powder to check for residual rubber traces, but the worn surface held nothing. Nevertheless, the scene map was updated with a clear new movement line. A small vehicle had appeared beside the wooden pier, not matching any witness descriptions, maneuvered around toward the side parking area, and left the zone at a time very close to when Jamie disappeared. To verify the departure direction, investigators returned to the gravel area, this time using surface moisture scanners and laser positioning to search for any remaining clues. An unevenly compacted spot was found at the edge of the lot, where the gravel had been pressed down in an oval shape, a sign sometimes left when a vehicle pauses briefly, then accelerates hard to continue. That oval matched the contact surface of a small tire size, further supporting the idea that the tracks near the pier and the compression mark in the lot belonged to the same vehicle. Notably, no one in the area reported hearing a loud engine that night. This led to the assumption that the vehicle had a small, quiet engine, or the driver had turned it off while approaching the pier to avoid drawing attention. These findings made the investigation team realize that the vehicle's presence didn't match any statements, and that could be significant. Either witnesses were seriously mistaken, or the driver had deliberately stayed hidden. Both possibilities pointed to the same conclusion. This vehicle's appearance was not coincidental. It had been there, right in the area Jamie walked down to the beach, then left via a discrete route. When all the data was added to the master map, the vehicle's path formed a semicircular arc, lying outside the main line of sight of tourists and boardwalk staff, opening an entirely new question. Could this have been the vehicle used to approach or leave the area at the exact moment Jamie vanished? There was no immediate answer, but the case's first tire tracks had made every theory more complicated, forcing investigators to keep following that mysterious route to determine how it connected to the items recovered from the sand and to Jamie Parker's traceless disappearance. The tire tracks that were documented prompted the investigation team to go back and thoroughly review all the statements collected from the night Jamie disappeared, to determine if anyone had mentioned the presence of a vehicle in the wooden pier area. Upon re-examining the witness list, they quickly identified two important but conflicting statements that had not been carefully cross-checked earlier due to the initial chaos. A man in his late 30s said he had seen Jamie walking down the pier with a strange man, tall build, dark clothing, walking right behind her. He couldn't recall the face clearly because of the dim light, but he was very certain that she was not alone at all. However, a middle-aged woman walking nearby told a completely different story. She clearly remembered the image of a young woman walking entirely alone down the pier, holding her thin jacket, with no one following or beside her. Her viewing distance was closer than the first statement, and she insisted that if anyone had been near the girl, she definitely would have seen them. The fact that the two statements were entirely opposite forced police to create a more detailed diagram of each witness's position at the moment they observed Jamie. A grid map was spread out, marking standing directions, lines of sight, light obstructions, and light sources from the boardwalk. When measuring the man's angle of view, they discovered that his position was offset at an angle where neon light from signs was blocked by a small kiosk. This restricted his view and made it easy to confuse shadows or coincidental overlaps with another tourist passing nearby. But the woman's statement could not be dismissed, as she was standing closer to the pier with a straighter, less obstructed line of sight. Based on data from the two witnesses, the investigation team drew two different paths on the map. Path A: Jamie walking down the pier with a man. Path B: Jamie walking alone with no one appearing in the dim lighted area around the pier. When both paths were plotted on the same coordinate system, an anomaly immediately stood out. There was a gap, not covered by any witness statement, stretching from the end of the pier to the sand edge where the second piece of evidence was discovered. This was the area where light barely reached, sea breezes blew strongly, and passers-by usually only glanced through for a few seconds before moving on. This meant that anything happening in that space could easily escape the view of all witnesses. This gap became the focal point of analysis. If Path A was correct, the strange man could have approached Jamie right in that dark zone, when no witnesses were still watching. If Path B was correct, Jamie had walked alone into the darkness and then encountered someone else there, someone no one saw. When overlaying the two paths onto the evidence map, investigators noticed that the second piece of evidence lay exactly in the overlap between the assumed movement path and this uncovered spatial gap. This created a new hypothesis. Regardless of whether Jamie was with someone or alone, the incident related to her disappearance most likely occurred in this unwitnessed segment. To strengthen the hypothesis, the team reapplied light analysis on the sand surface, measuring shadow overlaps and positions of light sources from the boardwalk to determine if any obstructions could create silhouettes easily mistaken by witnesses. The results showed that a person walking a few steps away from Jamie could be completely hidden from the woman's view but fall into the man's restricted sightline, meaning both statements could be partially correct. This made the situation even more complicated. Instead of a clear contradiction, the possibility of another individual near Jamie could not be ruled out, but that person's identity or direction of movement remained completely unclear. Finally, to assess feasibility, the movement map was overlaid with the tire track data. When doing so, a crucial detail emerged. The direction the tires left in aligned almost perfectly with the movement path that no witness had seen. This reinforced the idea that if someone had approached Jamie, that person could have used the small vehicle to leave the area immediately afterward. The two initially conflicting statements, after being analyzed through mapping methods, were no longer isolated pieces, but became factors pointing to the existence of a dangerous overlap zone, where all traces began to vanish and all lines of reasoning began to expand. This was the first time the investigation had a clear spatial structure to pursue. An unwitnessed dark area, an open movement path, and a very real possibility that Jamie had encountered someone else at the exact point where light from the boardwalk could no longer reach. The mysterious gap in Jamie's movement path led the investigation team to shift to a broader approach. If a stranger had appeared right in that unseen dark segment, then the chances were high that this behavior was not the first time. The lead investigator requested retrieval of data on all incidents that had occurred along the coastal area over the 2 years prior, to see if there were any similarities in the circumstances of disappearances, timing, or behavioral patterns. Records were compiled from 3 sources: Horry County reports, data from North Carolina north of Myrtle Beach, and missing persons cases recorded by the Coast Guard. When the reports were spread out on the table, many small details that seemed scattered when viewed individually began to form a distinctive pattern. 3 disappearances in Brunswick County in 1984 all took place late at night, in dimly lit beach sections, and all victims were young women walking alone from crowded areas out to empty sand. Another case in Surf City in 1985 showed the victim vanishing within less than 200 meters from the last lighted point of the boardwalk. None of the cases were solved, no bodies were found, and most notably, there were no signs in any of them that the victims had been swept out to sea. These similarities prompted the team to ask, could Jamie's disappearance be a continuation of a chain of behavior that had been quietly occurring along the coastline for years? The old reports had never been linked because they fell under different jurisdictions, but when placed on the same timeline, the repetition became clear. The timing was almost identical. Late at night, after the main boardwalk area started thinning out but still had enough people to create a false sense of safety. The locations were mainly the intersections between light and darkness where neon lights didn't reach, but it wasn't completely deserted beach either. The last sighting of the victims was nearly always the same: alone, or according to conflicting statements, someone walking right behind them. And especially, in all 5 previous cases, a detail that no one had noticed before emerged: small tire tracks that did not match the large vehicles typically used for coastal tourist activities. When technicians analyzed old photographs preserved from a 1985 case, they realized the tire grooves there were very similar to the tread pattern just discovered near the wooden pier. This was not easy to spot when looking at individual cases, but side by side, it created a suspicious connection. With hundreds of tourists every night, the odds of the exact same type of tire randomly appearing in 3 disappearances over 2 years were extremely low. This forced the investigation team to consider the possibility of one individual, or a small group, using the same type of vehicle, operating for an extended period without detection. To narrow it down, a list was created of owners of small vehicles, or those capable of moving into soft sand areas without leaving deep traces. People who had been reported for suspicious behavior at beaches north and south of Myrtle Beach in the recent 2 years were also added. Dozens of names were entered into the behavioral analysis system, then filtered by criteria: living near the coast, frequently present at night, owning a small vehicle or having experience driving on sand, and previously reported for disturbing behavior toward women. The list quickly narrowed from nearly 40 people to 12. Among those 12 names, one stood out not because of direct evidence but due to multiple indirect factors: Raymond Ray Hensley. Hensley lived in Myrtle Beach, worked as a boat repairman, had a habit of working very late, and often moved through low-traffic areas. He had been mentioned in 2 reports from 1985, related to standing too close to women walking alone late at night, but neither case was strong enough to build a file. Information on Ray was just a few short lines, but enough to place him on the broad suspect list. What drew investigators' attention even more was not the reported behavior, but the detail that he owned a rare type of small vehicle, an older off-road model with narrow tires, a quiet engine, and suitability for traveling on dry sand. This detail matched the characteristics of the tire tracks recovered near the wooden pier. No one rushed to conclusions, but the simultaneous appearance of a figure previously reported for odd behavior near the beach, who also owned the exact type of vehicle capable of leaving the scene traces, could not be taken lightly. Ray did not immediately become the prime suspect, but he was the first name marked in red on the analysis board, a symbol for the persons of interest category, those who needed closer scrutiny if subsequent traces started matching their behavioral profile or movement capabilities. When the name Ray Hensley was pinned to the board, the investigators now had an open direction, not a conclusion, but the first anchor point in a still very fragmented chain of data. The disappearances from 1984 to 1986 were no longer seen as isolated events, but as a unified series, with a high likelihood of one nighttime beach predator operating in a repeating pattern, and in that pattern, the name Ray Hensley began to emerge like a faint shadow at the edge of the light, not clear, not enough to charge, but sufficient to push the investigation into a new layer of complexity. While the broad suspect list was being narrowed down, one detail from a male tourist's statement began to draw attention. He insisted he saw a dark-colored pickup stopped near the path leading down to the beach on the night Jamie disappeared. Pickups were common vehicles with easily recognizable engine sounds compared to smaller ones, so this statement was immediately placed in the group needing verification. Even though the tire tracks found near the wooden pier did not match a pickup, the presence of a large vehicle in the area at a sensitive time could not be ignored. Based on the witness's description, dark color, long bed, tail light with a crack, investigators immediately checked traffic cameras near the beach exits. Camera systems back then were sparse and low quality, but one blurry frame at an intersection about 3 blocks from the beach showed a pickup passing through on the night Jamie vanished. Though the image didn't clearly show the license plate, the body style and color were fairly close to the witness's description. This was enough of a lead to start tracking down that vehicle. The investigation team went door to door in residential areas within a few-mile radius of the beach, asking every owner of older dark-colored pickups. After 2 days, they located one with a cracked taillight matching the description parked in the yard of a small house on the outskirts of Myrtle Beach. The owner was a middle-aged man named Carson Doyle, who had worked in construction and almost every night drove through the beach area after getting off work. When asked to cooperate, he was fully cooperative and showed no resistance. The truck was taken in for examination. Technicians inspected the undercarriage, checked the bed, collected soil samples, sand stuck to the tires, and analyzed the tread pattern. Imprints of this pickup's tires were taken and compared to the tracks found near the wooden pier. The results quickly showed no match. The tire contact width was too wide, and the tread grooves were completely different from the pattern at the scene. However, the investigation continued, because the witness statement and camera image still placed Carson in the area. To establish an alibi, Carson was interviewed. He stated that on that night, he drove straight home from work, stopped to buy food at a late open store near the highway, then went directly home and did not park near the wooden pier. The initial statement sounded unconvincing, but Carson produced a receipt from the purchase, matching the time frame when the camera recorded the pickup passing the intersection. When the investigation team went to the store to verify, the employee clearly remembered Carson as a regular customer and even recalled chatting briefly about the store soon closing. The time Carson was at the store, based on the receipt and the store's own camera, aligned exactly with the period when Jamie was last seen on the boardwalk. This almost completely ruled out the possibility of him being at the beach at that moment. Soil and sand samples from under Carson's truck also did not match the composition of the sand in the wooden pier area. The seen sand had a distinctive fineness and contained more crushed shell fragments than the samples from Carson's truck. Geological analysts confirmed this was a clear difference. After a total of 10 days pursuing it, a large amount of resources had been poured into investigating the pickup, but in the end, every verification showed the truck owner was completely innocent. There was no evidence he had ever deviated from his route home. Nothing placed him at the beach beyond the vague statement of one witness under poor lighting conditions. The lead investigator noted that this was an important wrong direction, not because Carson was suspicious, but because it had consumed nearly 2 weeks of manpower critical time in a disappearance that had only happened a few days earlier. When Carson Doyle's file was removed from the persons to clear list, the investigation team returned to the analysis board and reevaluated everything. The shadow of the pickup, once seen as a lead, became evidence of the danger of relying on unverified statements under unstable lighting, psychological, and memory conditions. The nearly 10-day waste made investigators even more cautious in every deduction. And while the pickup was crossed off the file, one important point was added to the internal conclusion. The small tire tracks at the scene were the accurate data, while the large vehicle the witness remembered might have been just a fleeting image unrelated to Jamie's disappearance. This misdirection brought investigators back to the persons of interest list, and the name Ray Hensley, which had been faint, began to stand out more clearly, not because of evidence against him, but because all the leads based on assumptions were collapsing, while the physical data from the scene kept pointing back to the dark area where no one saw Jamie for the last time. After the pursuit of the pickup was eliminated, the investigation team focused entirely on the physical evidence collected from the beach sand. To more accurately understand how Jamie vanished in the space between the boardwalk lights and the darkness under the pier, the expert group reconstructed the scene using light analysis and spatial simulation under the exact conditions from the moment she was last seen. Portable lighting systems were positioned to match the locations of the neon signs and bulbs on the boardwalk, based on electrical maps from that year. From there, they recreated the projection angles of each light source onto the wooden walkway, the pier leading down to the sand, and the entire boundary area between the beach and the boardwalk. When the lights were turned on at the correct height and offset, the light pattern became clear. Only a long strip of illumination reached halfway down the pier, with the rest completely submerged in darkness. Anyone standing at the edge of the pier looking down could only see a few steps ahead before everything turned to complete black. This explained why witnesses could see Jamie walking down the pier, but could not see her after she left the lighted strip. Beyond the light, the team simulated the wind direction from that night. Weather reports indicated wind blowing from the southeast at moderate speed, strong enough to erase shallow footprints, but not strong enough to deform deeper sand grooves. Wind fans were positioned accordingly to observe how small objects would shift. This helped them understand why the grooves near the second piece of evidence had not completely disappeared. Thanks to the combined simulation of light and wind, the shadow map emerged clearly. Anyone standing in the wide shadowed area between the pier and the waterline would be invisible from the boardwalk, a true blind spot that existed right in a busy area yet was completely shielded from all lines of sight. This blind spot stretched about several dozen meters, offset to the left of the wooden pier, close to where the first two pieces of evidence were found, but farther from the spot the search team had repeatedly checked in the early days. The lead investigator immediately ordered a thorough sweep of the blind spot, the first time with a higher level of detail. They set new boundaries, using stakes to mark points likely overlooked in initial searches. The sea breeze that night could have erased footprints, but if an object had been buried, depressed, or impacted, traces could still remain under the damp sand layer. The technical team began scanning each section in a small grid pattern. Sand depth probes were inserted continuously. Each time a probe hit a hard spot or unusual compaction difference, they stopped, marked it, and gently brushed the sand aside for visual inspection. After nearly an hour, at the edge of the blind spot, a technician bent down upon noticing sand depressed in an unnatural curved shape. After shifting the thin top layer of sand, a small metal object was revealed. It was not fully exposed like the second piece of evidence, but only showed one edge protruding from the base. The item was carefully lifted with tweezers and immediately placed in an evidence bag. This was the third piece of evidence, and it was instantly recognized as not belonging to the natural environment. The object's surface had scratches, as if it had been scraped against a hard surface, and one corner had a tiny bit of very fine fabric fiber stuck to it. The location where the third piece of evidence was found was more important than the item itself. It lay exactly within the blind spot, where no witness could have seen events unfolding at the moment Jamie stepped down the pier. The presence of evidence here significantly strengthened the hypothesis that the incident occurred in this dark zone, rather than on the pier or near the waterline. The reconstruction team immediately drew a simulation diagram of the three pieces of evidence and trace locations to determine if they formed a connected path. When the three positions were plotted on the map, a J-shaped curve emerged, starting from the last lighted strip of the pier, entering the blind spot, then curving lightly toward the waterline, where the second piece of evidence lay. This further reinforced the hypothesis that Jamie had moved or been led right into the blind spot area before disappearing. The light and wind resimulation also revealed one important thing. If someone was standing a few steps away from Jamie in the darkness, Witnesses on the boardwalk would not be able to detect it, and that person's shadow would not fall into the lighted strip, so no clear silhouette would form. This could explain why one witness insisted someone was behind Jamie, while another insisted she was walking completely alone. Each only observed part of the scene, limited by lighting and viewing angles. Finding the third piece of evidence right in the middle of the blind spot completely changed the structure of the investigation's analysis. Instead of viewing the statements as contradictory, the investigation team now determined that both statements were correct in their own way. They saw the same scene but from two different angles, obscured by lighting and shadow factors. The newly recovered evidence became the most important anchor point up to that moment, showing that whoever interacted with Jamie or Jamie herself, if she dropped it, was not in the lighted strip, but in the completely separate dark zone from the witnesses. With three pieces of evidence forming a logical path, and the newly identified blind spot, the investigation entered a phase where every hypothesis began to reshape in a more specific direction. Someone had been standing in the darkness at the exact moment Jamie vanished from the final lighted area of the pier. While the technical team focused on the blind spot and the evidence on the beach sand, another investigation group was assigned to thoroughly review all data related to where Jamie was staying. The motel where she stayed was not large, just 2 stories with a 24-hour night desk, and it had a steady flow of guests each night, mostly family tourists. Although Jamie's friends had clearly stated that she left the group to head back to the room early, no one had yet dug deeper into whether there was any unusual activity linked to her name in the motel's records. When pulling the check-in log, investigators immediately noticed something noteworthy. On the page containing guest arrivals from the night Jamie checked in, there was a line that had been erased with an old-style correction fluid. The faint whitening layer made the writing unclear, but the black ink indentations underneath were still faintly visible. The desk clerk explained that sometimes guests change rooms or cancel last minute, so staff have to make corrections, but investigators requested the original copies still kept in internal files. When comparing the two versions, the difference stood out clearly. The erased line had originally recorded a male guest's name, but in the internal archived copy, there was an additional small note. Asked for room number again later. This note did not appear in the active log, only in the original, indicating that someone had asked for a female guest's room number on the night Jamie checked in. Even more concerning, the recorded time matched a few hours before Jamie separated from her friends to head back to the motel. This detail was immediately placed in the leads related to possible stalking category. Investigators interviewed the night desk clerk to identify the man. The clerk said that on the night Jamie arrived, a strange man, around 30 years old, asked about the girl who came in with a group of friends wearing a light-colored top who just rented a room and what her room number was. The clerk refused to provide the information due to privacy rules, but the man kept asking indirectly, saying she asked me to pick up something for her, and then lingered in the lobby for quite a while before leaving. The clerk didn't remember the face clearly because the man wore a hat and stood in a shadowed corner under the ceiling light. But he recalled a deep, slightly raspy voice. When asked why the note was made in the original but not updated in the active log, the clerk said he felt uncomfortable with the man's behavior, so he wrote it down in case something happened, but the next shift updated the log and the note was overlooked. This was normal in a small motel but had unintentionally hidden an important detail. When cross-referencing the timing of the strange man's appearance with when Jamie was supposed to return to the motel, investigators spotted a major gap. If the man was at the motel before Jamie got back, there was a chance he left right after the clerk refused to answer and headed toward the boardwalk, where Jamie appeared alone before disappearing. This made the stalking from a distance hypothesis worth serious consideration. To verify, police checked footage from the convenience store across from the motel, as it was the only spot on that stretch with any recording equipment, even if the quality was poor. A blurry clip showed a male figure wearing a baseball cap walking past the store at a time very close to when Jamie left her friends to head back. The angle wasn't clear enough for identification, but the build matched the clerk's description. Tall, dark clothing, hands in pockets. The timeline was reconstructed. The man arrives at the motel, asks for Jamie's room number, leaves, and appears near the boardwalk within the window when Jamie was walking back. Nothing proved he approached Jamie, but the timing overlap was too suspicious to dismiss as coincidence. When investigators placed the erased line, the internal note, the clerk's description, and the blurry camera image on the same board, a pattern that was hard to ignore began to form. Jamie may have been noticed by someone before she even left her friends. This, combined with the blind spot and the evidence found on the beach sand, showed that Jamie's disappearance was not a sudden incident happening in a few seconds, but much more likely the result of a deliberate chain of actions that started before she stepped down the wooden pier. The strange man in the motel lobby identity, still unconfirmed, became a link, a new investigative direction that needed to be pursued. This was the first time the investigation had a lead pointing to possible intentional stalking, rather than just a random encounter in the dark area of the beach. Years passed, and Jamie's file remained in the unsolved cases category. But the evidence collected from the beach sand, especially the strange hair strand stuck to the first piece of evidence, was always carefully preserved in the evidence storage. By 2001, thanks to efforts to improve storage systems and advancements in DNA technology, the South Carolina State Lab began retesting evidence from long unsolved disappearances. Jamie's case was prioritized because it had a hair sample, which had higher analysis potential than other environmental DNA types that degrade easily. At that time, DNA analysis techniques were much better than in 1986, but there were still many limitations, especially with hair exposed to the seaside environment, affected by salt, wind, and sand. The lab carefully separated the hair from the evidence bag, using a microscope to examine the root to determine if it still had a follicle, the root sheath, or just the shaft. Upon observation, technicians realized the root was worn down, almost completely detached, meaning nuclear DNA inside was very hard to obtain. Still, they proceeded with the extraction process to recover the scant genetic material remaining. The initial results showed the gender of the person who left the hair was male, consistent with the hypothesis that Jamie might have encountered a man in the dark area before disappearing. But the biggest problem was that the amount of DNA recovered was too low, severely degraded, and could only produce an extremely limited set of markers. The CODIS system in 2001 required sufficient loci to match against profiled individuals, but this hair only yielded a small portion of the code, not enough to enter the database. In practical terms, the strange hair only indicated a man had been present, but could not specifically identify who that man was. When comparing the sample to suspects considered during the initial investigation phase, the results also brought no breakthrough. The few matching markers were not strong enough to implicate anyone on the persons of interest list, including the faint names that had been mentioned and then cleared. Investigators had hoped the hair could resolve the contradiction between the two statements about whether Jamie was walking with someone or alone, but the results left them at a dead end. Analysts had to write in the report that the DNA sample does not exclude the possibility of belonging to any adult male in the area, and is insufficient to confirm or exclude any specific suspect. Another issue arose. The seaside environment caused DNA to degrade much faster than in dry conditions. The hair's exposure to damp sand, salty wind, and possible abrasion could severely diminish the root material. This made their analysis window extremely narrow. One technician even detected the presence of crystallized salt particles on the hair surface, a sign that the strand may have been exposed outdoors for some time before collection. That further reduced its analytical value. After the DNA results were deemed unusable, the investigation had to return to traditional leads: witness statements, scene diagrams, physical evidence. But in 2001, when the file was re-evaluated again, most of the younger investigators could not connect the scattered points from 1986 in a coherent way, due to the lack of modern technology to reconstruct timelines. They could not determine whose head the hair came from among hundreds of people around the beach area that night, nor could they tell if it fell from the head, a collar, or due to random contact in a tight space. This turned the hair once hoped to crack the case into an open thread that could not be closed. The final report concluded the hair was not suitable for broad matching testing and had to be preserved for future DNA technology. The sample was resealed in a new generation specialized envelope, placed in a moisture-proof container, and returned to the county evidence vault. Jamie Kane Parker's file went back to where it started, a chain of events with only darkness, 3 pieces of evidence, and a strange hair that could not unlock an identity. The lead investigator, who had worked the case in the early phase, added a short internal note to the file. Current DNA sample offers no help. We'll need to wait for another generation of technology. That note received little attention at the time, but it would become a significant marker, because in the future, that very hair overlooked in 2001 would become the key that changed the entire case after nearly 4 decades. At this point, however, it was just a stalled trace, leading the investigation into a vast void and keeping Jamie's case in cold case status with no progress. In 2008, when the Horry County Evidence Vault was being inventoried for transfer to a new digital system, a technician accidentally discovered a small box tucked deep in an old iron cabinet behind layers of files that had been shifted years earlier. The metal box had no code in the updated catalog, but on the lid was a yellowed paper tag written in ballpoint pen, MB86, Field Materials. The code MB86 belonged to evidence seized in the Jamie Parker case from 1986. When the box was opened, inside was a sealed evidence bag, intact but covered in thick dust, showing it had never been touched. On the bag was written, "Collected, the 14th of July 2086, South Dune Corridor." The technical team immediately called the cold case investigator to confirm. The evidence bag was sealed to the standards of that era, meaning it could contain important material that had accidentally never been entered into the analysis process. When checking the scene collection log from that day, there was no record of the bag being lost, indicating the error occurred during initial cataloging, a serious but not uncommon mistake in large investigations from the mid-80s. The bag was taken to the analysis room. Inside were 2 items: a parking ticket folded in half and a small torn map fragment, apparently ripped from a larger map. Both items were coated in fine sand and some dry soil, as if they had been near bushes or blown by the wind before collection. The first thing that caught attention was the parking ticket. It was from a private lot just a few blocks north of the boardwalk. This was not a popular parking area for tourists, because it was off the main route. The ticket was printed with a date matching the night Jamie disappeared, but the vehicle entry time was several hours earlier than when she separated from her friends. A side note in the attendance pen read L row B6, the parking spot in the lot. That note was crucial because it allowed police to trace who used the lot that night, as long as records were still kept. When the investigation team contacted the lot management, they luckily found an old logbook where attendants recorded license plates by entry time. Though the paper had faded and the ink had blurred over the years, the B6 marker still matched a faint entry: a small black car with an old South Carolina plate. This raised a big question. Why was that vehicle parked in a little used private lot and then gone from the area before Jamie left her group? Suspiciously, the lot lay along the route leading directly to the blind spot strip on the beach. The path later evidence showed someone had been in on the night she vanished. The second item in the evidence bag, the torn map fragment, made everything even stranger. The map was a common type sold to tourists, marking beaches, restaurants, and shortcuts around the boardwalk. However, on the torn piece was a small black ink X placed exactly at the area where Jamie was last seen. The X looked hurried, not like the careful marking of someone noting a route, but as if someone quickly circled an important spot. Investigators did not jump to conclusions, but when they placed the fragment onto a full city map and aligned it properly, they saw the tier ran right along the route from the private lot to the wooden pier, a midway path the small vehicle could have taken. The 2 items in the evidence bag formed a notable logical chain: a vehicle parked in an uncommon private lot, a map fragment marking the spot where Jamie disappeared, both collected in the southern dune area where the first and second pieces of evidence were also found. When reviewing the collection location of the evidence bag, South Dune Corridor, the investigation team realized it was an area they had overlooked in early searches due to strong winds and overgrown grass. This made the bag's presence significant. It proved the items had once been in or near the blind spot, or blown from the blind spot to the Dune Corridor, then collected but not processed in time. The fact that the parking ticket was folded in half also raised questions. Had the vehicle owner tried to hide it, or did it fall out while someone was looking for directions? These questions could not be answered immediately, but the ticket with the L-row B6 spot led to a critically important consequence. Police could cross-reference it with vehicle registrations from that year. When they requested the DMV to pull plates from the lot's log for that day, the old microfilm system finally produced a blurry image of a plate. Though the quality was poor, the last digits were readable, and they matched an older small vehicle with narrow tires, remarkably consistent with the tire tracks recovered near the wooden pier. This was a key intersection between the lost evidence and the physical traces collected earlier. The map fragment with the small X further convinced the investigation team that its owner was not an ordinary tourist. No one would mark a map at a spot with no restaurant, no hotel, no amenity, unless they had a personal reason to focus on the dark section of the beach. When the evidence lost for 22 years suddenly reappeared, the investigation was reignited. Everything once scattered: the tire tracks, the beach evidence, the man asking for Jamie's room number, the shadowy figure near the boardwalk suddenly began to form connections. And for the first time since 1986, police had a strong enough new lead to reopen the case in a specific direction. The person who left the evidence bag could be the very one who approached Jamie in the darkness of the blind spot. In a single moment, a case thought dormant for 2 decades stirred back to life thanks to a misfiled evidence bag. When the lost evidence bag was discovered and the chain of clues began to align, the Horry County Cold Case team decided to send all biologically valuable evidence to private laboratories specializing in advanced DNA analysis. Among them, the most important remained the strange hair strand collected in 1986, the sample that had hit a dead end in 2001. By 2010, DNA technology had advanced much further, especially techniques for extracting DNA from hair without roots, which had been nearly useless in previous decades. The chosen laboratory was Othram, renowned for decoding degraded DNA through genome reconstruction technology. This was the first real chance to see if the hair on the evidence contained a strong enough clue to identify who left it. The sample was transferred in a moisture-proof container and opened under sterile airflow. Technicians used nanometer-scale DNA extraction methods, then amplified damaged segments with specialized enzymes. The process took many weeks. The recovered DNA segments were not complete, but sufficient to create a partial genetic profile, a type of profile that could not be directly matched in CODIS, but could be used for genealogical matching, meaning extended family comparisons. Othram's first step was to reconstruct SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Unlike the STRs used in 2001, SNPs allowed analysis of thousands of tiny markers to identify distant relatives down to generational levels. Once the SNP dataset was built, algorithms began running matches against genealogical databases voluntarily submitted by citizens through commercial platforms. This process did not aim for an exact match, but to find people sharing overlapping DNA segments with the hair sample from which a reverse family tree could be constructed. After weeks of running the algorithms, one family group stood out in the results: the Hensley family, with roots in the Piedmont region and most members living in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. The hair sample's SNPs overlapped about 13 to 17%, with 2 individuals in the database, a level sufficient to classify as second or third-degree distant relatives, such as cousins from a previous generation, uncle-nephew relationships, or a closer common ancestor. The fact that the hair linked to the Hensley family immediately prompted the cold case investigator to reopen all data from the 80s. When the full family tree was constructed, the algorithm determined that the person who left the hair had to belong to the male branch of this family in the age range corresponding to the generation born around 1950 to 1965. Investigators checked Myrtle Beach resident lists from that time and found a few Hensleys in the area, but only one matched all the data points. Male, living near the beach, often out late at night, and consistent with behavior reported in 1985. That name was Raymond Hensley, the very name once placed on the broad persons of interest list in behavioral analysis years earlier. When investigators added the information to Othram's genealogical analysis system, the algorithm produced stronger results. The hair sample had high compatibility with those carrying the Y chromosome line of the Hensley branch, and in the Myrtle Beach area, in 1986, only 2 people belonged to this group. One had moved away before Jamie's disappearance. The remaining one still lived in the area, had been reported for suspicious behavior near the beach, and most notably, owned a small off-road vehicle with narrow tires matching the tracks recovered near the wooden pier. In the report sent to police, Othram stated clearly, "The DNA sample cannot identify an individual, but can narrow it down to a family range, with the highest probability belonging to a male in the Hensley branch, specifically those born 1950 to 1965. For Horry County Police, this was a major turning point. For nearly 25 years, no genetic clue had led them to a specific family. Now, genealogical technology had done what CODIS could not: connect the strange hair to one family, and not just any family, but the family of Raymond Hensley, a name that had appeared and then vanished in the early investigation years. From 2015 onward, with the explosive growth of forensic genealogy, police continued sending requests to refine the SNP profile. Each time, Othram's upgraded algorithms narrowed the list of males who could have left the hair sample. By 2021, when testing a new form of analysis, microhaplotype mapping the hair yielded the strongest result yet. The probability that the person who left it belonged to the Hensley family tree exceeded 99.4%. This data was not sufficient for legal individual identification, but strong enough to make Ray Hensley the priority suspect for the first time in the official file. The cold case investigator compiled a list of Ray's life events from 1984 to 1986. Jobs, residences, vehicles, travel habits, and reports of odd behavior near the beach. When combined, Ray's entire behavioral pattern aligned disturbingly with Jamie's disappearance timeline. Present in the boardwalk area on weekend nights, often driving along the beach late, mentioned in cases involving young women being followed, and, most importantly, owning the exact type of narrow-tired off-road vehicle matching the marks left in the sand. Forensic genealogy had accomplished what decades of witness statements, maps, physical evidence, and old DNA technology could not: pull a suspect out of the shadows and into the center of the file. When the final results were printed and pinned to the analysis board, the lead investigator had only one sentence to describe it: "The hair we couldn't do anything with in 2001, it's finally talking." And the investigation entered an entirely new phase. When the forensic genealogy results pointed to the possibility that the hair sample belonged to the Hensley family branch, police began digging deeper into the men with that last name who had lived in or frequently visited Myrtle Beach during the mid-'80s. In the process of reconstructing the family tree and analyzing residency data, one name emerged prominently, right beside Raymond Hensley: Nolan Hensley, Ray's second cousin, a few years younger but living in the same area for many years. Nolan became a focus of attention not because of DNA, but due to a detail completely outside genetics. He had once owned an older off-road Jeep, dark-colored, the type of vehicle several witnesses had vaguely described in incidents along the coastline from 1984 to 1986. The Jeep had larger tires than the vehicle that left tracks at Jamie's scene, but in the era when leads were still hazy, any off-road capable vehicle was taken very seriously by police. DMV records showed Nolan sold the Jeep about a year after Jamie disappeared, but at the time, the vehicle was still in the Myrtle Beach area. What drew investigators' attention even more was that Nolan had been in the city during the exact month Jamie vanished. When brought in for questioning, Nolan confirmed he had visited Myrtle Beach to see relatives and hang out at the beach for a few days, but his stay timeline did not match information from a bartender near the boardwalk who remembered serving a man named Hensley on the very night Jamie disappeared. The description the bartender provided: tall build, slightly raspy voice, black shirt, baseball cap, pulled low, could fit many people, but the name Hensley made police unable to ignore it. When Nolan was asked if he had been at that bar, his answers changed several times. At one point he said he had gone in but left early. At another, he claimed he never stepped inside, just walked past. Misremembering small details is normal, but changing statements about whether or not he visited a specific location at a sensitive time could not be overlooked. Investigators noted Nolan's statement as inconsistent. The basic principle in investigations is, when all data starts pointing to one specific family branch, any member of that branch present near the scene must be considered a potential suspect. With Nolan, suspicion grew because the new Othram data could not yet distinguish between two male relatives in the same genetic line. When checking further residency data, police discovered Nolan had rented a small motel room near Kings Highway during the exact week Jamie disappeared. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, they saw Nolan appearing in the boardwalk area on weekend nights before Jamie's disappearance. A server at a beachside eatery remembered him ordering takeout around the time that overlapped with when Jamie left her friends. Nolan strongly denied it, saying he was not near the boardwalk late that night and had returned to his room before the area emptied out. However, an old friend said he might have been a bit drunk and wandering around the boardwalk later than he remembers. The friend's statement made police even more skeptical. Meanwhile, another lead kept Nolan in focus. He had been reported in a minor incident in 1984 at Wrightsville Beach, where two young women said a man driving a Jeep followed them briefly on the sand before turning away when they ran into a lighted area. There was no evidence of a crime and no specific charges, but Nolan's older Jeep and his presence in Myrtle Beach made police consider whether he had a similar behavioral pattern. With all these factors, Nolan became a seemingly reasonable suspect in the investigators' eyes. They decided to quietly collect biological discard samples from the trash outside Nolan's home for DNA comparison. However, when the lab ran the analysis, they discovered something crucial. Nolan's SNP profile did not match the 1986 hair sample. He belonged to a different branch of the family, not the one Othram had identified as matching. This caused the DNA suspicion against Nolan to collapse immediately. But since the DNA only proved it was not him and did not rule out indirect involvement, police continued investigating through other methods. Timelines, witnesses, vehicle characteristics. When police located Nolan's Jeep maintenance records, they found that from May to July 1986, the vehicle had a broken drivetrain and could not drive onto sand without getting deeply stuck, making it nearly impossible for him to use it to access the beach the night Jamie vanished. Garage records even noted the Jeep only became reliably operational again late in the year. Cross-referencing with the scene tire tracks, technicians reconfirmed. The tracks were small, narrow, and light, completely incompatible with Nolan's Jeep, which would have left marks twice as deep. The vehicle match became illogical. Combined with the incompatible DNA, the broken Jeep during the critical period, and Nolan having no reason to be in the pier area at those hours, suspicion toward him gradually faded. Ultimately, the inconsistent statements were re-evaluated psychologically. Nolan admitted he had memory issues when drinking on vacation, and he likely mixed up days or places. One investigator clearly noted in the report, "Nothing in Nolan's statement suggests intentional concealment. The inconsistencies likely stem from confused memory, not guilt." When the conclusion was reached, Nolan's file was moved to excluded. This not only narrowed the list but also made the name Raymond Hensley stand out more than ever. The genealogical DNA matched Ray's branch, not Nolan's. Nolan's Jeep could not have been the vehicle that left the scene tracks. Nolan was in Myrtle Beach, but there was no evidence placing him in the blind spot or near where Jamie walked down the pier. Though he initially appeared as a potential suspect, Nolan was ultimately determined to be just noise, a misleading direction that cost investigation time but was a necessary step to rule out every possibility before focusing on the real suspect. And when Nolan's name was crossed off the list, the investigative path pointed in only one clear direction. Ray, the older relative, with unusual behavior, present in the area, and with DNA in the family branch most compatible with the hair sample collected in 1986. When Nolan was officially cleared from the file, all remaining genealogical results pointed to only one person who could fit the DNA branch matching the hair sample collected on the beach sand in 1986. Raymond Hensley. He had been mentioned in reports of strange behavior near the beach, was present in Myrtle Beach throughout the 80s, and owned the type of small vehicle consistent with the tire tracks found near the wooden pier. But to turn suspicion into evidence, police needed one crucial thing: Ray's current DNA. Ray lived alone in a small house not far from the marsh area north of Myrtle Beach, in a low-traffic spot. He kept a very private life, had no social media, didn't join any groups, and usually worked in the boat repair shed behind his house. Approaching him directly to request a DNA sample could make him suspicious or lead him to destroy evidence. So the investigation team decided to use a legally permitted method: obtaining DNA from household trash left at the curb. This is a familiar technique in modern investigations, especially in cold cases where the suspect has lived freely for years. Surveillance was set up to monitor Ray's trash disposal habits. After a few days of observation, they noticed Ray typically took his trash bag out to the curb early in the morning, before full daylight. When Ray placed the bag at the roadside in compliance with local rules, the surveillance team immediately collected it. The entire bag was sealed and sent straight to the state lab. Inside the trash were everyday items: soda cans, note papers, tissues, and especially an old toothbrush, an ideal DNA source. There was also a disposable plastic cup with faint lip marks and a snack bag with chewing residue. Technicians extracted samples from all three items in case one wasn't high quality. The DNA from the toothbrush yielded the most, enough to build a complete genetic profile to modern standards. Without Ray even knowing, the epithelial cells still clinging to the bristles provided his full genetic code. Once the profile was built, the next step was simply comparison. The new sample was run through two parallel analyses: legal standard STR matching and SNP matching against the previously generated genealogical data from the 1986 hair. In the first run, the results were so clear that technicians reran it to ensure no error. The markers matched perfectly with the strange hair from the evidence where Jamie vanished, with near zero deviation across the entire SNP chain. This meant the person who left the hair in 1986 and the person who used the toothbrush found in the trash in 2024 were the same individual: Raymond Hensley. There was no longer any chance of random coincidence. No longer any side suspects in that DNA branch. No longer reason to keep Ray in the general suspicion category. This was the confirmation the investigation had waited 38 years for. The results were sent to the cold case investigator, who immediately presented them to the county prosecutor to obtain a search warrant. But even before the home search warrant was issued, police recognized the significance. With current DNA fully matching the DNA recovered from Jamie's disappearance scene, Ray had officially moved from person of interest to direct suspect. The scientific report stated clearly, no individual other than Raymond Hensley could be the source of the hair sample seized at the scene in 1986. The genetic marker chain, once degraded, had now been fully decoded thanks to genome reconstruction technology. Ray's DNA from the toothbrush showed a 50 out of 50 match with the hair sample, exceeding the suspect threshold in criminal investigations. When compared to the genealogical data, the new sample overlaid the entire family tree Othram had identified, proving the hair belonged to Ray, not a relative of his. This was the critical detail. Previously, forensic genealogy could only narrow to family, but now the direct DNA match confirmed the individual identity. A closed-door meeting was held with the investigation team. The investigators clearly felt the turning point of the case: the scene map, evidence items, tire tracks, blind spot, lost evidence bag, the man asking for Jamie's room number, all had once been faint pieces, but DNA was the undeniable piece. When the prosecutor signed the search warrant, the first thing they did was deploy the team into Ray's home to collect further evidence, focusing on personal items, old documents, and anything that might contain DNA or root diagrams. But even in the morning reviewing the file, the lead investigator said one sentence everyone immediately understood the weight of: we have the identity of the person who left DNA at the scene. Now the task is to prove he was there, and explain what happened to Jamie Parker. For a cold case stretching nearly 4 decades, the moment of complete DNA match was the shift from hypothesis to reality. Ray Hensley, after years as just a faint name on a suspicion list, now had to step directly into the center of the investigation. The DNA evidence didn't just open the door, it blew apart the old rotten one and made the case officially enter an irreversible phase. The search warrant was signed the next morning, and the investigation team deployed to Ray's wooden house, isolated on a small dirt road near the marsh area. The house looked ordinary from the outside, with weathered wooden roofing and a front yard scattered with a few boat repair tools, but experienced investigators all knew that the quietest places often hid the most unexpected things. When Ray was not home, the forensics team immediately entered. Inside, the house was not cluttered as they had expected. Everything was arranged too neatly. Tables and chairs perfectly aligned, items in their exact places, floors cleaner than normal for a man in the boat repair trade. The first impression was that Ray tried to keep everything the same every day, a classic sign of someone wanting to control their surroundings to hide something. As they moved deeper into the hallway, a small door at the end of the house caught attention. The door had no sign, but it was locked with an old-style padlock used only for tool cabinets or personal rooms. Investigators broke the lock per procedure and shone flashlights inside. No one said anything for the first few seconds, because before them was a small room, about the size of a storage closet, but organized in an unusual way. Cardboard boxes stacked neatly horizontally, an old metal cabinet, a low workbench, and a wooden chair without a back. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs the room had been forgotten. It was used regularly, but always kept secret. When the forensics team brought the cardboard boxes out and placed them on the large table in the living room, tension rose. The first box contained ordinary items: old bills, administrative papers, photos of seascapes. But the second box started revealing problems. Inside were a few small items wrapped in cloth: a tarnished silver keychain, an old motel key card without a room number, and what made the whole team stop, a thin silver metal bracelet, slightly bent from time. Investigators immediately recognized it as nearly matching the description Jamie's friends had provided from 1986. Jamie always wore a thin silver bracelet with a small pattern engraved on the inner side. The lab brought the bracelet under light, and when flipping the inner side, a small swirling curved pattern appeared matching exactly the description of the item Jamie usually wore. This was not a random bracelet. This was Jamie Parker's personal belonging. Finding it in Ray's hidden room was a major turning point. No one doubted Ray's level of involvement anymore. But the bracelet was just the beginning. In the metal cabinet, the forensics team found an old manila envelope. Inside were assorted papers and receipts. Among them was an item that made everyone immediately notify the lead investigator: a parking ticket still intact with the printed date, belonging to the exact private lot where the ticket was found in the lost evidence bag. The code on the ticket: L row B6. Same marker, same lot, same date, same chain of events. Finding the parking ticket in Ray's storage room proved what the investigation team had long suspected but never had evidence for. The vehicle parked in the private lot that night was Ray's vehicle, and he had kept the ticket as a stored item or something he dared not throw away. A young investigator had to pause for a moment to realize the importance of this evidence. It not only placed Ray in the boardwalk area the night Jamie disappeared, it placed him at the exact parking spot of the person who went into the route leading to the blind spot. A perfect match that could not be coincidence. In a lower cabinet drawer, the forensics team continued finding more small items. A cloth bag containing frayed denim fabric pieces, as if cut or torn from clothing. When examined under a magnifying glass, they saw faded blue threads, characteristic of denim popular in the 80s. What made investigators stand silent for a few seconds was the similarity in color, shade, and fiber structure to the denim piece found near the third evidence item in the blind spot area. When bringing the two pieces out for direct comparison, textile forensics technicians confirmed they came from the same type of fabric, same weave pattern, and the torn edges of the two pieces showed signs of matching in thread twist and tension before tearing. Though it could not be said they were once a complete piece, the probability of two matching denim types appearing in this case and one of them found in Ray's hidden room was too high to be coincidence. At this point, no one on the investigation team doubted what the entire case had waited nearly 40 years for. Ray Hensley had been in the blind spot where Jamie disappeared, and he had taken or kept items directly related to her. As the forensics team continued searching the room, They discovered a few more personal items not directly related, but saying a lot about the perpetrator's psychology. Small handwritten notes about isolated areas around Myrtle Beach, an old map highlighted at potential blind spots, and a list of parking lots that could observe the boardwalk from a distance. None mentioned Jamie, but their presence in the same space as her bracelet was enough to paint a clear picture. The hidden room appeared to be used for storing things. Ray did not want anyone to see things with no reason to exist in his house if he had not intentionally kept them. Most importantly, each item linked directly to the clues collected on the beach sand in 1986. The lead investigator noted in the report, "No longer suspicion. This is physical evidence placing him at the scene. From the bracelet to the parking ticket to the denim piece, all formed a coherent chain, connecting straight from the 3 evidence items found on the beach to the secret room in Ray's house, a room he had maintained for many years as a storage for things he never wanted discovered." As the forensics team boxed the evidence and sealed each item per procedure, the lead investigator just stood still for a moment, looking at the hidden room door, as if finally seeing the place where it began, and also where it was buried, what had happened to Jamie Parker on that summer night in 1986. Ray was brought to the police station the same day as the search, under the pretext of assisting the investigation. He entered the interrogation room with an overly calm demeanor, shoulders relaxed, eyes looking down at the floor, hands rubbing together constantly, the kind of gestures from someone trying to stay composed rather than someone completely innocent. When the investigator asked the first question about the night Jamie disappeared, Ray immediately denied any involvement, saying he didn't know who she was and wasn't at the boardwalk that night. That was his first statement. The investigator did not challenge it, simply placing an envelope containing photos of the evidence on the table. The silver bracelet, the parking ticket, the denim piece, then gently sliding it toward Ray. He glanced at them but tried not to show emotion. When asked why these items were in his private room, Ray changed his tone, shifting to a new explanation. He found the bracelet on the sand many years ago and kept it because he thought it had value. That was his second statement, completely contradicting the initial denial. The investigator did not rebut it right away, instead turning on the screen displaying the DNA match results, showing the hair from the 1986 evidence matched perfectly with the DNA from the toothbrush in Ray's trash. His face fell, eyes blinking faster, a typical sign of realizing denial was no longer working. When asked to explain, Ray switched to a third statement, trying to shift blame to someone else. He said Nolan, the relative already cleared, had borrowed the storage room and might have been the one who left the bracelet and parking ticket. He repeated Nolan's name multiple times, trying to suggest it might have been him, not me. The investigators just took notes and let Ray finish. Then they presented 2 facts he could not overcome. First, Nolan's DNA did not match the hair at all. Second, there was no trace Nolan had ever entered Ray's house during the relevant period. The blame shifting thus collapsed almost immediately. Faced with this dead end, Ray began shifting to a fourth statement, the kind from someone trying to minimize responsibility rather than deny everything. He said he did meet Jamie, that he might have talked to her, but it was just by chance and he never harmed her. This is a familiar statement adjustment for organized offenders, moving from absolute denial to admitting a small part of the events to make their words seem more honest. The investigator recorded every detail of the changes in Ray's statements. None of his statements matched the previous ones, and all avoided the most important part. How Jamie's bracelet, the private lot parking ticket, and the denim matching the beach evidence ended up in his hidden room. When analyzing the language of his statements, experts noted Ray used vague structures. Maybe, I don't remember clearly. If I did anything, it wasn't intentional. These phrases appeared heavily in the third and fourth statements, signs of someone adjusting the story when faced with evidence. When asked why the parking ticket from a vehicle in the area leading straight to the blind spot was in his house, Ray circled back to saying, "I often keep parking tickets for scrap paper." This completely contradicted his earlier statement about not going to the boardwalk that night. When the investigator asked him to explain the denim piece matching the sample found in the sand, Ray evaded with, "I have a lot of old stuff," but when asked to describe the pants the fabric came from, he could not describe the shape or color. The inconsistency in his words, led the behavioral analysis team to immediately classify Ray as an organized offender. Someone who tends to prepare hiding environments, categorize evidence, control speech, but when cornered, continuously changes the story in a salvage direction. The behavioral map showed Ray always trying to shift attention to others, especially Nolan, even though DNA and physical traces had completely cleared Nolan. This fit the pattern of a lone offender, someone wanting to portray himself as a peripheral witness rather than the perpetrator. The investigators continued letting Ray talk, because each time he changed his story, added another self-contradiction, strengthening the file. As the interrogation dragged on, Ray began shifting to circular statements, long sentences with no information, trying to dilute the truth. However, each such statement was recorded and marked as a sign of controlled panic. When the investigator reminded him again that the DNA matched perfectly, that the evidence was in a hidden room, and that there were no signs anyone but Ray used that room, he stopped answering. He just lowered his head, rubbed his forehead, sighed, but offered no new statement. The interrogation ended not with a confession but with silence, the familiar silence of suspects who realize every denial path has been blocked. With 4 statement changes, a failed blame shift, and a series of contradictions, Ray was no longer just a suspect. He had become the only person every clue, piece of evidence, and DNA data pointed to. The interrogation ended, but for the investigation team, the story was now entering the decisive phase. Building the indictment, based on Ray Hensley's entire inconsistent statements and criminal behavioral pattern. As Ray's statements continued to contradict each other, and physical evidence piled up against him, the investigation team shifted to the hardest part, proving Ray was actually in the blind spot on the night Jamie disappeared. To do that, they had to rely on a source that had been considered useless for years: blurry, distant surveillance footage stored in the town's archives from the 80s. Of the few cameras operating at that time, only 2 were pointed toward the boardwalk area and the path down to the wooden pier. The resolution was so poor that most images had been deemed unusable for identification. But image analysis and AI technology in 2024 had far surpassed what was possible back then. Technicians fed the original tapes into an enhancement system, restoring brightness and predicting motion on each pixel based on reflected light. They knew in advance they would not see Ray's face, but they only needed one thing: body shape and shadow. When recreating the lighting based on weather data from that night's southeast wind, neon light from bar signs, and sodium lamps at the pier head, they were able to reconstruct how human shadows fell on the sand from 3 different angles. After multiple simulation runs, one thing gradually stood out. The shadow of a person, appearing in the northern camera footage, matched perfectly with Raymond Hensley's standing posture. The slightly tilted stance to the right, relaxed shoulders but head slightly bowed, left leg bearing weight lightly, exactly as investigators had noted when Ray walked into the interrogation room. At the moment the camera captured that shadow, Jamie was still on the boardwalk. About 5 minutes later, the second camera recorded another shadow, smaller, walking quickly, with the build of a young woman walking alone that the analysis team believed was Jamie. The anomaly lay in this: the man's shadow from the first camera moved into the darkness first, clearly heading toward the path down the wooden pier, and stopped right in the area later identified as the blind spot. When simulating the lighting, technicians discovered a key detail. The patch of darkness where the man stood was the exact zone invisible from the boardwalk side, the same area where the evidence items were found. For the first time, they had a simple but clear image. Ray was standing in the blind spot, even before Jamie appeared. And not only that, the second camera, though blurrier, captured the moment Jamie's shadow entered the overlap of light where neon reached part of the wooden pier, but not the beach sand. Then her shadow vanished completely. Right after that, at the edge of the frame, a taller shadow shifted slightly, moving from its original standing position and retreating deeper into the darkness. This was a detail overlooked for nearly 4 decades. Under new analysis, it was an extremely important movement. It showed the man was not just standing ready in the dark, but moved at the exact moment Jamie disappeared from the lighted area. When technicians overlaid the two extracted images from the cameras onto the 3D reconstructed scene map, everything aligned perfectly. Ray was standing just a few steps from where Jamie vanished. In the time gap between the two camera sweeps, shadow analysis further indicated a height match. The man's shadow stretched 2.4 times the actual height based on the neon light angle. Using physical data, investigators calculated the person was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. Ray was exactly 5 feet 10 inches. Nolan was not, he was nearly 4 inches taller. Additionally, Ray had a habit of standing with slightly uneven shoulders, causing his shadow to tilt characteristically to the left, a trait not present in others in the Hensley family. All these factors were compiled into the forensic imaging report, marking the first time in the case's history that blurry video footage had become directional evidence. When combining the camera clips, lighting, shadow patterns, evidence locations, and timing confirmed from the parking lot log, investigators built the first complete timeline in 38 years. Ray appears near the private lot, leaves his vehicle, and walks toward the wooden pier. 2. Ray reaches the blind spot a few minutes before Jamie, and stops as if waiting. 3. Jamie walks down the wooden pier, and heads toward the beach. Camera captures her shadow. Ray's shadow shifts when Jamie's shadow disappears. 5. No additional vehicle or third person appears in that time frame. The 3 evidence items are later found within the exact range where Ray stood. This timeline had 2 major implications. It placed Ray at the precise location of Jamie's disappearance, and it proved no one else fit better to explain her sudden vanishing. The lead investigator wrote in the report, "The lighting and camera data no longer allow any other explanation. The only shadow present in the blind spot at the moment Jamie entered the darkness belongs to Raymond Hensley." From here, the case was no longer a series of scattered clues. It became a seamless flow in which every shadow, every faint movement, led straight to one single truth. Ray was there, at the right time and the right place, when Jamie Parker vanished from the light. The trial of Raymond Hensley took place in the fall, nearly 4 decades after the night Jamie disappeared. The courtroom was packed, not because of the sensational nature of the case, but because of the extraordinarily long duration of a story once buried under the sands of Myrtle Beach. The prosecutor stepped up first, holding the thickest file in the history of a missing person case in Horry County. 38 years of investigation, 4 generations of investigators, hundreds of forensic reports, and all of modern science mobilized to reconstruct the moment Jamie vanished from the light. The prosecutor's opening did not dwell on emotion but began with one sentence. "We will show you all the evidence, and it all leads to one person." Then the first witness was called, the forensic expert, dispatched by Othram. He stepped to the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and presented in a clear, coherent voice. He began with DNA structure, how the hair collected in 1986 was degraded, lacking enough markers for classic STR, but sufficient for reconstruction using new generation genome technology. Next, he explained building the SNP profile. "We were not looking for an exact individual match, but for people carrying similar genetic segments. When we built the family tree, we obtained a clear relative group, the Hensley family." The prosecutor asked him to specify the match level. The expert replied, "The probability that the 1986 hair sample belongs to someone outside the Hensley branch is under 0.6%. The jury took notes intently as he moved to the most critical part. The current DNA obtained from Ray's toothbrush. When comparing the current sample and the hair, we found complete compatibility. No other individual could be the source of the DNA. The prosecutor displayed the match chart on the large screen. Each marker lit up in perfect pairs. There was no murmuring, no objections, only the silence of the jury as they looked at undeniable evidence. After the DNA portion, the prosecutor called the forensic imaging team those who analyzed shadows and blurry cameras. They explained how neon light reflected off the wooden pier, how shadows stretched based on the angle, how AI reconstructed each pixel to understand the movement of a man standing in the blind spot. One technician presented a height chart based on shadow analysis. The man in the camera is 5 feet 10 inches tall. The defendant is as well. No one else on the suspect list has the matching height. The prosecutor asked them to describe the movement recorded from the northern camera. The technician explained. The man's shadow appears a few minutes before Jamie's shadow walks down the wooden pier. The man's shadow shifts right when Jamie's shadow disappears from the light. There is no third shadow. The people in the gallery sat silently, as if they could see the image with their own eyes, even though the camera was too blurry to identify a face. When forensic imaging concluded, the prosecutor moved to physical evidence. Jamie's silver bracelet, the private lot parking ticket, the torn denim matching the type, the map marked at the spot where Jamie vanished. A veteran investigator took the stand, explaining how they found Jamie's bracelet in Ray's hidden room. This is a personal belonging. Jamie never took it off. Its presence in the defendant's locked room cannot be explained in any innocent way. Then he presented the parking ticket. The code LROB6 matches exactly the logbook from July 14, 1986. This lot is a few minutes' walk from the blind spot. And the denim piece. We compared it under a microscope. The threadwear level alone on these two pieces falls within a 96% match range. It cannot be coincidence. At this point, the prosecutor began reconstructing the entire case with science, step by step, clearly, without sentiment. He drew the complete timeline on the board, connecting the pieces of evidence into a seamless chain of events. Ray parks in the private lot. Ray walks toward the wooden pier. Ray arrives at the blind spot first and waits. Jamie walks down the wooden pier. The camera captures her shadow. Ray's shadow shifts. Evidence items fall within the range where Ray stood. Jamie's bracelet is found in Ray's hidden room. Ray's DNA matches the sample from the scene. Ray changes his statement 4 times and tries to blame Nolan. There is no gap in this chain of events, the prosecutor said. Only one person standing where Jamie disappeared, and that person is Raymond Hensley. The defense attorney objected on grounds that the camera is too blurry and the hair DNA could be cross-contaminated. But the forensic expert immediately countered. The DNA was matched using SNP methods, not old STR. That is an absolute result. There is no cross-contamination over 4 decades. The defense attorney tried arguing the bracelet could have been picked up on the sand. The prosecutor simply asked, then why did the defendant hide it in a locked room? There was no answer. When reaching the statement analysis portion, the prosecutor began presenting the offender pattern. He projected the transcript of Ray changing his statement 4 times, complete denial, saying he found the bracelet, blaming Nolan, admitting he met Jamie but denying harm. This is not misremembering, the prosecutor said. This is the typical structure of an organized offender when faced with undeniable evidence. A behavioral analysis expert presented the pattern. Vague language, shifting from denial to partial admission, attempting to shift blame to a relative, all reflecting the behavior of a controlled offender trying to craft a safe narrative. When concluding the presentation, the prosecutor closed the file and said, not emotion, not speculation. This is science DNA, genealogical mapping, forensic imaging, physical evidence, and contradictory statements, all leading in the same direction. The courtroom fell silent. The jury looked at each other, then at Ray, who sat motionless, hands clenched into fists, eyes looking down as if trying to withdraw from the world around him. The trial moved toward its conclusion. But everyone understood that the verdict had been written by science, by the light from those blurry cameras, by the hair strand buried by sea winds for 38 years, and by a truth no one could hide anymore. The jury left the deliberation room in the late afternoon on the 5th day of the trial, after more than 7 hours of intense discussion. No one said a word as they returned to the courtroom, but the expression on each face said it all. The decision had been made, and it was not an easy one. The court asked everyone to rise. Raymond Hensley was asked to step forward 1 pace. He still maintained his familiar bowed head posture, hands clasped tightly in front of his stomach, shoulders drawn in as if trying to make himself smaller. But his eyes hardened when he heard the judge ask the final question. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, holding the folded sheet of paper. Her voice trembled slightly but was clear. We have. The judge asked her to read it. In the heavy, almost frozen atmosphere, the words fell into the space like metal striking the floor. We find the defendant, Raymond Hensley, guilty of kidnapping resulting in death under federal statute. A long silence stretched across the courtroom. Several spectators raised hands to their mouths. An old friend of Jamie bowed her head and cried. Ray's family, sitting motionless in the back row, went numb as if hearing a sentence meant for someone else. But Ray heard it clearly. He looked up, for the first time staring directly at the jury, then at the prosecutor, an expression not of anger, not of defiance, only a weary acceptance, as if the thing he had tried to evade for 4 decades had finally caught up. The judge continued reading the court's explanation. With full DNA evidence, genealogical data, imaging analysis, and physical evidence recovered during the search of the defendant's home, the court finds that the defendant's actions meet the legal criteria for the charge: kidnapping resulting in the death of victim Jamie Lynn Parker in the summer of 1986. The prosecutor did not celebrate, did not smile. He simply stood straight, hands clasped behind his back, as if understanding this verdict was not a victory but the end of a story that had dragged on too long. Defense counsel requested consideration of mitigating factors, but the judge shook his head. For this charge, the minimum and maximum sentences are clearly defined. The court will sentence within statutory guidelines. When asked to step forward to hear the sentence, Ray complied, but his legs wavered slightly. Officers helped him stand steady. The judge read slowly, "For the crime of kidnapping resulting in death, the defendant is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Some in the room held their breath. Some exhaled. Ray showed no reaction, only tightened his hands briefly, then released them. The judge added, "This sentence is considered to reflect the severity of depriving a young woman of her freedom and her life, and concealing the act for decades. The defendant's every effort to evade justice cannot erase legal responsibility." An investigator who had followed the case through the cold case phase nodded slightly, not out of joy, but because finally their years of persistence had not been in vain. As officers approached to cuff Ray and lead him from the courtroom, he turned his head one last time, looking around as if searching for an escape in a room that held no light for him anymore. But the metal door behind, where defendants are taken away, was already open. He walked through it slowly, silently, and the door closed right behind him, the heavy clang echoing enough to make the gallery vibrate slightly. The judge declared, "Court is adjourned." People began to stand, but no one left immediately. No one said it aloud, but the entire room understood that this verdict did not just end a legal process. It closed a story that had lasted 38 years, from one night of disappearance in Myrtle Beach to a brightly lit courtroom. A court clerk gathering documents even whispered to the lead investigator, "Finally, this day has come." The investigator only replied, "This isn't the day we win. This is the day Jamie gets her voice back." A life sentence could not bring Jamie back, but it reclaimed the truth, and in cases that span nearly half a lifetime, sometimes the truth is the only thing left that can be given back. The Jamie Lynn Parker case file was closed under the light of modern science. But the final page of the investigative report was not a story about the verdict. It was a meticulous analysis of why the case took 38 years. When the lead investigator wrote the first line of the summary report, he did not hide the mistakes. In 1986, we overlooked things we should not have overlooked. The biggest mistake began right in the first hours after Jamie disappeared. The wooden pier area leading down to the beach sand was not immediately cordoned off. This led to the possibility that footprints, tire tracks, and small objects were displaced by passers-by or sea breezes. Another mistake lay in over-reliance on vague witness statements, especially the description of the dark-colored pickup. Investigators back then believed the large vehicle was a key lead, causing the team to pursue a wrong direction for nearly 10 days. While the actual tire tracks at the scene belonged to a much smaller vehicle, the next mistake came from unsystematic evidence collection. The evidence bag containing the parking ticket and map fragment was misplaced in storage and lost for 22 years. This failure alone stalled the case at a stage when it might have been solved by the late 80s. Another regrettable oversight was not immediately bringing in lighting experts or reconstructing the scene. The blind spot existed for 4 decades without anyone noticing, simply because no one simulated how neon light from the boardwalk fell onto the sand. That dark area was exactly where Ray waited for Jamie, and where Jamie vanished from everyone's view. The report stated clearly, "We took 38 years just to realize that darkness was the most important witness." When listing all the mistakes, the investigator did not diminish the efforts of previous generations. They pointed out the reality that forensic technology in 1986 was too limited. DNA was not widespread, image analysis was primitive, and forensic genealogy did not exist. "We did not fail due to carelessness," the report noted. "We failed because of the era." As if to close the error analysis section, the lead investigator wrote one simple sentence. "Science stood on the victim's side, but science in 1986 was not strong enough to hear her voice." After the error evaluation section, the report shifted to the most prominent part. Why forensic genealogy succeeded where old methods failed. The scientific analysis was over 40 pages long, compiled from Othram reports and gene experts. The first reason was stated clearly. Forensic genealogy does not rely on one-to-one matching like CODIS, but on extended relatives, allowing suspect identification even if the person has no DNA record. Jamie's hair sample was heavily degraded, without a root, but contained enough SNP markers to build a partial genetic profile. An email from Othram to the investigation team was quoted verbatim in the report. "This DNA sample could not solve the case with 20th century technology, but it was strong enough to decode with 21st century technology." The second reason. Genealogical mapping allows narrowing suspects based on family patterns, not just behavior or statements. When the family tree was built, only 2 people remained in the matching branch, and current DNA eliminated one, leaving Ray as the sole suspect. The third reason. Forensic genealogy has an advantage. Traditional investigation lacks time, does not kill genetic evidence. It only delays decoding it. The hair strand lay in evidence storage for nearly 4 decades, but the genes inside remained structured enough to reconstruct. The report wrote, "In long-running cases, hair may age, but DNA does not age the way we do. It only waits for the right technology." The fourth reason involved combining technologies. Genealogy provided a narrow suspect list. Forensic imaging placed them at the location. Current DNA confirmed identity, and physical evidence told the unfinished story. No single technology could solve the case alone. They had to work together. The prosecutor's report was quoted. "Genealogy is the map. DNA is the compass. Shadow analysis is the footprint. Physical evidence is the voice. Together, they form the truth." Finally, the report concluded the technology section with one bold line. "This is not magic. This is science doing exactly what it was born to do, finding the ultimate truth." The final part of the file closed, not by talking about Jamie or Ray, but about what the case left for the national investigative community. Horry County decided to include this case in training programs for new investigators as a national case study. The Federal Bureau of Investigation incorporated the forensic genealogy portion into training courses on next-generation DNA technology. The National Forensic Training School added shadow analysis to the forensic imaging curriculum, using the exact blurry Myrtle Beach camera footage as a classic example of never overlooking data even if it looks useless. The report clearly listed 5 learning objectives drawn from it. 1. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, must be processed and stored properly, because time can turn something minor into the key to solving the case. Genealogy does not replace traditional investigation, but it can put traditional investigation back on the right track. Do not rely on a single witness statement when lighting conditions cause witness memory to distort. Technology cannot save a weak investigation, but it can revive a strong one buried by time. 5. Cold cases never truly die. They only wait for the right tool at the right moment. When closing the last page, the lead investigator wrote the concluding words. The Jamie Parker case teaches us one simple thing. The truth does not disappear. It is only covered by darkness. And when there is enough light, whether from AI, DNA, or forensic techniques, darkness finally has to retreat. The file was sealed. The case was closed. But its lessons continued to live, spreading beyond investigation rooms, beyond courtrooms, becoming part of United States investigative history, where science finally returned a voice to a young woman who disappeared under the neon lights of Myrtle Beach in the summer of 1986. The story of Jamie Lynn Parker's disappearance is not just a nearly four-decade journey to find justice. It reflects many lessons that people in the United States today still need to remember. First, the fact that Jamie walked down the wooden pier into a dimly lit area where it seemed safe but was actually full of blind spots reminds us that crowded public places can still harbor dangers if we do not pay attention to our surroundings. Those dark seaside areas, where cameras cannot clearly record, highlight an important principle in American urban life. Personal safety starts with spatial awareness, and one should never separate from friends when out at night in poorly lit areas. The case also exposed the initial mistakes of the 1986 investigation, from believing the misleading description of the pickup to the evidence bag lost for 22 years, reminding us that in life, overlooking small details can lead to consequences lasting decades. Even just a folded parking ticket misplaced was enough to bury the truth. More importantly, the case shows that science, from forensic genealogy to AI shadow analysis, is becoming a pillar of justice in American society. Ray's DNA collected from a toothbrush in household trash proves that modern technology can break through every layer of concealment, sending a clear message: no crime can hide forever, and justice is not eroded by time. Finally, the story reminds us of the persistence of the investigators, those who kept working even when the case had gone cold. In a vast society like America, where many families are still waiting for answers, this is a reminder that faith in the system and community perseverance can turn the seemingly impossible into reality. Thank you for following to the end of the journey to reclaim the truth for Jamie Parker. If you find this story meaningful, please hit subscribe to join us for the next cases. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring how justice and science bring light back to stories thought long forgotten.